Hospitals in Ontario just froze orders. Canberra just rejected U.S. demands. And inside the White House, Trump's preparing a 200% tariff on insulin. This isn't about trade anymore. It's about medicine. The microphones were still hot when Trump said it. We'll be announcing something very soon on pharmaceuticals. They're going to be tariffed. Very, very high. Like 200%. That wasn't a bluff. On July 8th, from inside the Roosevelt Room, President Trump delivered what sounded like an ultimatum. Either bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back to U.S. soil or pay. The policy wasn't vague. It came with a clock. 18 months. Countries had that long to shift production or accept a 200% import tariff on critical drugs. Blood plasma, insulin, antibiotics, all of it on the table. The justification, national security. The method, maximum leverage. But within 24 hours, the backlash began. And not from adversaries. Australia didn't respond with threats. It responded with defiance. The country exported over $2 billion in pharmaceutical goods to the U.S. last year, much of it through CSL, a global biotech giant with dual operations in Melbourne and Pennsylvania. Yet, instead of appeasement, Canberra hardened its position. Treasurer Jim Chalmers labeled the threat deeply concerning, but stated unequivocally, Australia would not alter its pharmaceutical benefits scheme. PBS mandates price negotiations between the government and manufacturers, ensuring affordability for citizens. To reverse that, Chalmers said, would be trading sovereignty for access. The U.S. may hold the market, but Australia, for now, holds its ground. Here lies the first fracture. A policy framed as economic nationalism has become a direct challenge to allied health systems, and it's revealing something unexpected. Australia and the U.S., long aligned on defense, are diverging on medicine. The contradiction is structural. Trump demands flexibility. Australia's model is built on rigidity, for cost control, not concession. Meanwhile, Canada took a different route, one that speaks volumes. It didn't hold a press conference. It didn't issue condemnations. As of July 8th, Canada hadn't even received a tariff letter. But inside Ottawa, preparations began quietly, not for confrontation, but for insulation. According to MedTech Canada and the University of Toronto's Centre for Pharmaceutical Policy, over 80% of Canada's pharmaceutical raw materials pass through multiple jurisdictions, often re-entering the U.S. before arriving in Canadian hospitals. A 200% tariff wouldn't just hit exports, it would disrupt the loop. Health Canada has already started triaging drugs, mapping out which medications could survive in a tariff-choked pipeline. And yet, Canada's pharmaceutical footprint in the U.S. is minor. Just under 5% of all generic medicines sold in the States are Canadian in origin, according to the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association. President Jim Keon told Reuters on July 10th that Canada isn't the target, but could get caught in the crossfire. The contradiction isn't geographic, it's economic. Low volume doesn't equal low impact. Tariffs on Canadian generics wouldn't shift U.S. manufacturing, but they could, bankrupt small batch producers who rely on cross-border economies of scale. A minor export to the U.S. can be the only thing keeping a production line open in Ontario. Remove that link, and the domestic market suffers too. So Canada is lobbying from the inside, not with headlines, but with data. Industry stakeholders have submitted internal briefings to both U.S. and Canadian negotiators. The request, tariff exemptions on humanitarian grounds, not commercial ones. Trudeau's administration may be out. But Carney's isn't improvising. Every move is calculated. That calculation matters. Because Trump's approach is not limited to pharmaceuticals. On July 7th, formal tariff notices were sent to Japan and South Korea. Beginning August 1st, all imports from those nations would face a flat 25% tariff across all categories. The justification? Reciprocity. The delivery? Truth Social. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a pressure tactic, laid bare. These tariffs may be modified upwards or downwards depending on our relationship, Trump posted. But Japan and South Korea aren't adversaries. They're strategic allies, militarily and economically. The same allies Trump needs to counterbalance China. And yet, they're now collateral in his tariff framework. Markets reacted immediately. Nissan fell 5%. Honda dropped 1.5%. The Dow, S&P, and Nasdaq lost nearly 1% across the board on July 7th. Bloomberg analysts attributed the movement not to volume, but to uncertainty. With every new tariff letter, clarity decreased. And as one Goldman Sachs memo warned, policy volatility is now the primary geopolitical risk to equities. That risk extends beyond Asia. Treasury sources, speaking anonymously to the Wall Street Journal, confirmed what allies had feared. The U.S. lacks the bandwidth to negotiate bilateral pharma exemptions with over 100 trading partners. Instead, countries will be grouped into 3 tiers, facing tariffs between 10 and 70%. Uniformity was the goal, but chaos may be the outcome. Let's think about this, because this isn't just a tariff dispute. It's a redefinition of what a trading partner is. Allies like Canada and Australia are discovering that shared values no longer guarantee economic exceptions. The new rule isn't alignment, it's obedience. And that's where Canada made its move. While many governments scrambled to meet Trump's July 21st deadline, Ottawa opted for something else. Silence. There were no last-minute amendments, no surrender on regulatory standards, and no high-stakes speeches. Instead, Carney focused on domestic stabilization packages, preparing sectors like aluminum and biotech for incoming shocks. That silence wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, understands leverage differently than Trump. While Trump plays deadlines, Carney plays liquidity, institutional resilience, and regulatory alignment. He's not trying to outtalk the US, he's trying to outlast it. And Wall Street noticed. According to Bloomberg's July 12th market wrap, investor optimism in North American equities surged after Canada dropped its digital services tax, a move seen as a good faith gesture toward the United States. But, that optimism was premature. Carney hadn't offered new concessions. He'd simply removed a point of friction. The core issues, pharma tariffs, raw material restrictions, supply chain resilience, remain unresolved. Meanwhile, Trump is running out of calendar. If Canada doesn't sign a pharma deal by July 21st, the White House will have to choose escalate tariffs on an ally just months before the election, or step back and risk appearing weak. Neither option supports the narrative Trump has built around strength and speed. Australia, for its part, isn't flinching. CSL is already exploring expanding United States operations. But the company, headquartered in Melbourne, won't shut down Australian labs. And with PBS untouchable, Canberra may become a case study in resistance. It's not that they want confrontation, it's that they see compliance as a trap. In contrast, South Korea's Ministry of Trade has requested urgent clarification from the USTR, asking whether life-saving drugs would be treated differently than consumer goods under the 25% regime. As of July 13th, no clarification has been given. For Seoul, this isn't just about trade. It's about whether alliance means anything when economics are on the table. Then there's China. Quiet. Watching. Not targeted under the July 7th tariff wave. Still under a temporary truce until mid-August. But every rift between the United States and its allies makes Beijing stronger by default. They don't need to escalate. They just need to wait. Trump's pharma tariff push was supposed to trigger reshoring, but even that's uncertain. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, over 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China and India. The United States doesn't currently have the manufacturing base to replace what it's threatening to tax. So who benefits? Nobody, clearly. But some are maneuvering, and rightfully so. India's Chipla has increased exports to South America in anticipation of U.S. volatility. The European Union is accelerating drug procurement talks with Indonesia. And Singapore's Temasek just invested $275 million into alternative supply chain biotech startups, betting that the United States will price itself into a corner. The numbers don't lie. In June, Canada's services PMI fell to 44.3, signaling contraction. In the United States, freight and shipping forecasts were revised down 1.6% after uncertainty over tariff implementation. The damage is already measurable, even before enforcement begins. And yet, Trump shows no sign of pausing. On July 10th, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told CNBC that the results of the Pharma Section 232 investigation would be released by month end. That's the legal framework allowing Trump to use national security as justification. If that report echoes the justification used for steel and aluminum, then the pharma tariffs are not just probable, they're imminent. What comes next? A narrow exemption for Canada could still arrive. Keon of the CGPA says there's hope that ongoing trade talks will preserve tariff-free status for Canadian generics. But even he admits, we've learned not to overreact to statements, but to wait for the executive order. That wait could cost companies millions. The pharmaceutical industry thrives on predictability. Forecasting, compliance timelines, regulatory harmonization, these are the pillars. But a 200% tariff, not based on violation but on production geography, flips that logic on its head. Companies like Teva, Sandoz, and Apotex may face, binary choices: relocate or exit the US market. If that sounds like leverage, it's only half the picture. Because if generics disappear from shelves, US patients won't get cheaper alternatives. They'll get none. As Bloomberg reported on July 13th, over 90% of prescriptions filled in the US are generic. Any disruption to that pipeline, even 5%, cascades. If the US slaps 200% tariffs on life-saving medications from allies and the allies don't blink, what happens when the drugs stop arriving? That's not a headline. That's a hospital logistics crisis. And yet, that risk doesn't seem to be altering the White House's posture. The clock ticks toward August 1st. Tariffs are scheduled. Negotiations are jammed. The gap between economic intent and diplomatic reality is widening. Trump may still see this as a strength move, but from Tokyo to Toronto, it's being read another way. The United States is willing to weaponize supply chains that were once considered sacred. Pharmaceuticals aren't semiconductors or steel. They don't wait for price signals. They expire. The countries facing penalties are the very ones the United States once called its healthcare innovation partners. Now they're on notice. The logic of alliances, built on trust, not compliance, has been inverted. Trust isn't being lost. It's being priced. This isn't about trade anymore. It's about whether medicine becomes diplomacy's next battleground. And if Trump follows through, the next drug shortage may not come from supply issues. It may come from a tariff code. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.